Greetings and welcome to Trinity Radio. I'm Johnathan Pritchett, and today I have with me Tim Stratton, recently christened Dr. Tim Stratton from the Northwest University, PhD in theology. He is the founder of Free Thinking Ministries, and as someone who affirms libertarian free will, we are the only people who can think freely, aren't we? And he also is the author of a brand new, well, what, 3 weeks, 4 weeks? It's been out for a month?
Yeah, about a month or so now.
Yeah, that's still brand new book, Human Freedom, Divine Knowledge, and Mere Molinism, a biblical, historical, theological, and philosophical analysis. That's actually a shorter subtitle than some that I've seen, so well done on that. Yeah, I would hold up my copy too, but I don't have a copy. But there you go.
I'll get you one.
See, most people, it's in my queue to buy, which means there's 30 books ahead of it. But when people send me their book, I bump it to the top of the list. Leighton Flowers still owes me. He sent me the Potter's Promise with a sweet little note in it, but he never sent me that little short ditty that he wrote. So I've never said anything good about it. But that's how that works. Also, but I need to also announce that you've recently been knighted professor here at Trinity College of the Bible Theological Seminary, and we are super excited about that. We love having you, Chris Date, Chris Featherstone's on board, Leighton Flowers, along with Braxton Hunter, myself, and Dr. Chatham and Dr. Daphne Washington, and a whole host of others. Man, our team is just getting big while other seminaries are shrinking. That's good news for us. But man, we are glad to have you on the program. We're glad to have you at Trinity. I'm so excited. I've already watched some of your classes, so I'm excited for our students, man. So tell us how you're doing.
Man, I'm doing good. I'm just hanging out here in the middle of nowhere in Nebraska. You know,
that is nowhere, yeah.
Home sweet home, but I like it like that. Yeah, so I'm having a good time here, and so far it's pretty free. I don't have to wear the mask too often, but I take the skater with me most places. But enjoying a little bit of libertarian freedom, and
your mask looks like a mercenary's mask.
Well, what would you expect? I'm the libertarian freedom fighter. I gotta.
There you go. So. Yeah, that's awesome. I actually like your mask. I have a pretty cool mask. It's from my church, so they were handing a mask, got the church logo on it, so that was pretty cool. I haven't been to church much because they have to cap it, and I think other people need Jesus more than me. So, I'm just kidding. But I like the title of your book, Mere Molinism, and Mere Molinism. That seems to be a label for mere Molinist for a lot of people who maybe not on board with everything that Molina was saying. And I like mere Molinist better than what Braxton Hunter, he calls me a self-loathing Molinist. So
what does that mean?
Yeah. So, well, because I have my quibbles, but I basically affirm what you're talking about if you just say mere Molinism.
Mm-hmm.
So that today I wanted to talk to you about 3 Molinism questions. I mean, just questions that I have, and so that you can get me out of the self-loathing category into, something. I like the mere Molin. I stand by that. But so the first thing that I want to talk about, and I don't actually have a problem with this, but it is a problem that is often accused of Molinist in general, and I've been accused of it too. But it doesn't bother me, but it seems to bother a lot of Christians when they hear this, whether they're Molinist or not. And that is, I'll frame it as a question: is Molinism being philosophical? Is that really a knock against it that means anything? Is that really a problem for Molinism? Is that a bad thing that it's philosophical?
Yeah. I guess I've heard that too. Yeah, that's just it's too philosophical. It's not biblical. And I'll say, look, if somebody thinks that a view being too philosophical is a knock against it, then I'd say, well, if it's a knock against Molinism, then it's also a knock against any of its competing contenders, whether it be Calvinism, open theism, the simple foreknowledge view, or what have you. Molinism. Well, I'll just say this: if a view is true, it will always be logical, even if you can't figure it out, because truth and logic are inextricably linked. You can't have one without the other. And so if the view is too philosophical, that just means it's too logical or logically coherent or what,
Right.
well, fine, then I'll take that as a compliment. And in the first chapter of my book, I explain how to do good hermeneutics, and understanding truth and logic is vital to coming to the author's original intent and understanding what Scripture actually means. So you can't do hermeneutics apart from logic and even philosophy. But oftentimes the logic and philosophy, that sometimes people will dismiss the word logic and they'll say, oh, that's too philosophical, when I've just focused on logical coherence. And I'm like, well, look, Molinism simply surveys all the biblical data. So the second chapter of my book is looking at all the biblical data.
Right.
I got tired of people saying that Molinism is all philosophy and not based on biblical data. And so I decided to start with biblical data. I first start with how to interpret Scripture, and then I look at Scripture.
Yeah.
And I make my case from there.
Yeah, let's stop right there, because I have to remind people. I mean, number one, philosophy, if it's good philosophy, it's a good thing. If it's a bad philosophy, it's a bad thing.
That's right.
But every theological idea is underwritten by philosophy. And every exegetical method or hermeneutic approach is also underwritten by philosophical considerations that are prior than to when they say, well, I prefer to do, I'm a biblical studies guy, but I'm like, look, whatever method of exegesis you're doing is underwritten by philosophy, because the second you defend it, you're going to start giving me rational basis for why that you interpret it. And I said, good philosophy can shoot down crap exegesis, just like good theology can shoot down crap exegesis, and good exegesis can shoot down crap philosophy and crap. See, these things all work together. But the second you talk about exegesis, is that's the baseline. No, your method of exegesis is underwritten by philosophical considerations. You can't escape philosophy, so you better be good at it. And the problem is people who knock philosophy are typically bad at it. And that's why they try to hurl it as, some sort of knock against something, when I'm like, no, this is a good thing. I freely admit, philosophically sound in my exegetical method. I'm philosophically sound in my theology, and philosophically sound, in my philosophical reasoning and deployment of logic, which can smack down nonsense. And so good philosophy smacks down bad exegesis and bad theology. So I take it as a compliment. So I get so sick of that. They say man's philosophy. Well, your hermeneutic method is man's philosophy too. There's a philosophy that underwrites it. So I have a real problem with people actually saying this as if it's a bad thing, because if you look at the people who hurl it, namely our Calvinist friends, it's like, do you not know how much philosophy underwrites your theological ideas and your exegetical method? How many things that you presuppose when you read a text, like Genesis 50:20, all of these metaphysical ideas that are nowhere in that sentence, that what you meant for evil, God meant for good. They have a whole metaphysical umbrella, that of ideas that they import into that. I'm just like, no, let's talk about philosophy, because you're really bad at it. But so I don't get it, but you've dealt with this, because William Lane Craig's heard this from critics for years. Philosophy, Molinism in particular, as if providence and determinism and compatible, as if those aren't philosophical ideas that are somehow read between the lines of every Bible verse that they like. But you've heard this a lot, right? I mean, Molinism is too philosophical. So you've heard my rant, but I mean, what about that though? What do you do with that when you're challenged on those grounds?
Yeah, I can't tell you how often I've heard, well, you're just appealing to man's logic. And then I say, well, you're just using man's mathematics when you go to the bank.
Right.
I mean, what does that even mean, man's logic? Right. Logic, I believe, is no more man's than mathematics is. Right. I think it's grounded in the nature of God.
Right.
I think even when you look at John 1:1, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. He was with God in the beginning. I probably got that wrong. But the word.
Well, see, you're a philosopher, not a Bible guy. That's
that's right.
I'm just kidding.
The Greek word for word is logos, and in Greek that means the principle of reason, and and logos is where we get the word logic. So really, you could say that John is referring to the second person of the Trinity as the logic.
Yes.
I think he's saying, look, you can't make sense of reality apart from Jesus. But anyway,
Right,
apart from
that's exactly what he's saying. And Heraclitean terms about in the arche, right? That which undergirds all of that was the Word, and the Word was with God, and Word was God.
yeah.
Logos, that's all. You know, if you read Heraclitus, for all those people out there. I had this conversation with in the last episode because I believe that John was writing from Ephesus, and the last guy talking about what the in the arche and the logos was Heraclitus, and of course Heraclitus is the famous philosopher. But John, if he can be philosophical, I don't see why Molinists can't, right? I mean, it's just, is he using, he's using Greek philosophy, which is the boogeyman for every doctrine people don't like these days, which I'm like, Greek philosophy is awesome, dude. You could never be as smart as those guys.
Let me just reference really quick a block quote that I have in the first chapter of my book.
Yes.
It's from Grant Osborne in a book that he wrote called The Hermeneutical Spiral. I won't read the whole thing, but he starts out and he says, the theologian must truly be a Renaissance person, for it is necessary to exegete the scriptures, collate the theological threads via biblical theology, be aware of the development of dogma throughout church history, then contextualize all this for the modern situation. And at each stage, philosophical reasoning plays a critical role. In a very real sense, the theologian is asked to be an expert exegete, historian, and philosopher. Philosophy helps the theologian to avoid subjective reasoning and to ground theological formulations in critical reasoning, coherence, and rationality. Let me skip a bunch, and he ends and he says, most theologians today argue that inductive and deductive methods must be integrated in constructing theological systems. So you can't exegete scripture. You can't come to a good hermeneutic apart from good philosophy and logic. And so I don't consider myself to be a professional philosopher. I am a theologian, but a good theologian has to know his philosophy. And so I study philosophy hard, I study logic hard, and I make sure to surround myself with PhD logicians. So we've got to take it seriously.
Amen. Couldn't say it better than you or Grant. Well, yeah, I can, but I'll be humble. But yeah, of course, Grant Osborne, that book, The Hermeneutical Spiral, is filled with gems. So I want to commend that book to people as well. But I'm glad that you quoted that, and because you had that off early on in your book.
Yep.
So I hope that we've dealt with that. I'm unashamedly a philosophy fan, and I don't know, except probably from the Reformed tradition, where you get this knock against philosophy within Christian circles. But it is what it is. So my second question I want to throw you with, this one's a little technical, so I'll I'll ask the question, and then I'll try to just give me a second to kind of unpack it. Okay.
All right.
But one of the things that hangs me up is, how does Molinism not create a logical, and I'm not talking about temporal, right? We're talking about God in eternity past. There is no temporal sequence of events or thoughts in his mind. We're talking about a logical. But how does it not create a logical dependence between God knowing something, which is an attribute of God, and God decreeing something, which is an action that God takes, that he doesn't have to take? It's not part of his essential nature to do something. He can refrain from doing something because he has libertarian free will, right? So he can issue a decree or not, but his knowing something, an attribute. In Molinism, it's like Calvinism in the sense that you have God's natural knowledge, and then you have God's middle knowledge, whereas Calvinism doesn't have that. Then you have the decree there, and then you have God's free knowledge, okay? And so God's free knowledge is logically after the decree. Okay, but to formulate a decree in his mind, to issue a decree to create so that he can have knowledge of events that will obtain. In his middle knowledge, we all agree he has knowledge of what, in Calvinists like Bruce Ware would admit this as well, of all the possibilities that could obtain until he issues a decree to create. Okay, but he issues a decree, right?
Yeah, that's natural knowledge.
Well,
everything that it could do.
Everything it could do, and in middle knowledge, everything that could be
that would happen if.
Yeah, the could be's. If the could be if, or would be if.
Would be if, yeah.
Would be if God created. The decree sets the actualized cosmos that comes to be, which then informs God's knowledge of what will be,
yes.
and his free knowledge. Right. And see, so what I'm saying is, why does God have to perform an action to have his free knowledge? See, why is there not a logical dependence between God doing something and his attribute? And I know that it's not a temporal sequence that God learns after he says, I'm going to decree this. Oh, now I know what will be. I'm not saying that. And a lot of people, when I bring this up, say, no, it's all in eternity. It's all something. Yeah, I know that. But to know something is an attribute. To decree something is an action. So it seems to me that God's eternal attribute of knowledge is logically dependent upon an eternal action, or an action taken in eternity past. And I have a problem with that, because God should never have to not know something unless he does something.
Okay. So there's several things to unpack here.
Yes.
So yeah, definitely. I mean, this could even get us into time theory and things like that. But yeah, definitely the Molinist is not committed to saying that God performed an action in eternity past. I believe God's first act was probably around 14 billion years ago. But
yeah, to speak, create, or however he brought creation into existence, right? But the decree is actually prior to that. But the decree is not an attribute of God. The decree is something that he does, not something that he is.
So let's break it down like this. So God does know all things prior to his first action. And let's just say, for the sake of conversation, that was the act to create the universe. Let there be, bang, right? So God knows everything logically prior to that first act. So let's suppose that his act of creation was the first thing God ever did. So with that in mind, now we're thinking about the Big Bang, even if it wasn't. This is the model we're going to work with just to help us understand this. So thinking about the Kalam now might help us gain some clarity here about Molinism. So consider the fact that the rational inferences provided by the Kalam show that God exists in what I like to describe as a static state of aseity. So in the static state of aseity, that God exists, the universe does not exist in that state. So that is to say that prior to the beginning of the existence of the universe, God exists, and then, to use temporal language, God then creates the universe. So considering the static state of aseity, the question is raised, is God maximally great in this state? So here's the cosmological quiz that I like to give. So I say, question 1, is it true that God existed in a state of aseity logically prior to creating the universe, and thus without the universe? Most people are going to say yes to that.
I say yes, but I believe in God, right? So
right. Okay, question 2. In this static state of aseity, is God omnipotent?
Yes.
Yeah, most people are going to say yes to that, at least most Christians. So if so, then does God possess the power to create creatures with libertarian freedom, even if he never does?
Yes.
Now, yeah, I mean, definitely if you believe in libertarian freedom, that humans have it, then of course you're going to say yes. And I would say even the vast majority of Calvinists will say yes to that question.
Yeah. The only ones who wouldn't would be those who think that libertarian freedom is internally contradictory, but that's never been shown to my satisfaction. There's nothing inherently contradictory about the idea at all. So
right, and I don't think most Calvinists would hold to that. That would be
some do, yeah, some do.
Some do. But in my book, I
for no reason, but yeah.
In my book, I show that God has it. And so if God has libertarian freedom, then there's nothing incoherent with it. And so then I argue that he can create humans in his likeness. And so we can then have a limited libertarian freedom.
There are Calvinists who don't believe that God has libertarian freedom as well.
Right.
I just want to point that out to our audience, that there are Calvinists who think that because it's impossible, not even God has it.
Right.
But I just for a bonus, they base that on the strongest motive idea of freedom, right? But there's two problems with that nobody has ever done anything with to my satisfaction to rebut it, which is why I know Calvinism or compatibilism, at least theistic, well, even atheistic compatibilism, is gibberish. And one, it rests on a tautology that all that you're really telling us is that the prevailing desire prevailed. You're not telling us that the strongest desire, you're just telling us that the prevailing one prevailed. You have no idea of its quality as strongest or not. You're just telling me that the prevailing one prevailed, which is a tautology that means nothing and gives us no information. Number two, when you say the strongest desire, like God can only act on his strongest desire, in accordance to his nature, and I can only act on my strongest desire. What you're saying is you act on your strongest desire. You choose according to your strongest desire. And the reason why we know it's your strongest desire is because you chose it, because you choose according to your strongest desire. And we know it's your strongest desire because you chose it. And it's a viciously circular argument. So this is how we know we take... Right. Yeah. So there you can, anyone who says this is compatibilist is spewing irrational gibberish that you can chunk in the trash. That's for free.
Yeah. And I, that's really based on Edwards, on Jonathan Edwards' views. And I spend a lot of time, I have a whole chapter devoted to Edwards in my book. And then in a later chapter, demonstrate how always choosing based on one's greatest desires is going to blow up in their face. It doesn't work, especially when it comes to rationality. You want to be able to choose not based on your greatest desire, but you want to be aimed at truth. Right. I mean, if your beliefs are aimed at your greatest desires, then you've got a rationality problem. I think God created us with cognitive faculties that can be aimed at truth, especially if we're careful. And but if we say, well, I believe X because it's my greatest desire, well, big deal. Who cares what your subjective desire is? You want objective truth.
Right. And this is where I went through it's fallacious argumentation and a trivial tautology just so that we can show that it's totally bunk. But even on a low shelf level for the common folk, you tell the common folk that they're always choosing according to their greatest desire, they're going to call you out on it and be like, no, I hardly ever choose against my greatest desire, right? And then you do this little Spice Girls dance where they tell you what you want, what you really, really want, based on, because you did that, and they're like, no, that's not what I want. Quit being a Spice Girl. That's not what I want. And so, it's frustrating because you try to explain to them, this is what vicious circle. I'm not just saying circular, I'm saying viciously circular. So it's irrational blather that you're giving me. And then it's also, it doesn't even give you the strongest desire. It's just you telling me what prevailed, and the prevailing desire prevailed. And that gives me no information whatsoever. So why are you still doing this? But they do it anyway. Yeah. But God has libertarian free will. And I hope the majority of our Reformed friends agree with that. And I think probably they do. The ones who want to be argumentative on Facebook probably don't. And maybe a few of their premier, not hyper, but high Calvinists might go there. But I think most run-of-the-mill Calvinists would agree that at least God is free to do what he wants.
All right. Well, I won't share all my arguments now, but in my book, I give some deductive arguments that demonstrate that God's got to have libertarian freedom, at least with some things, right? He doesn't, just because he cannot, I'm not saying, really God, I believe that humanity has libertarian free will in some things, but not all things. And I think the same is true for God. He's actually got some things to choose between that we can't. But as long as, I argue in my book, as long as one has the ability to choose between a competing range of alternative options that are each compatible with one's nature, then one has libertarian freedom. And so I just start out with creation. God can choose to create or not to create.
Mm-hmm.
And both of those are within his nature. He's got the ability to do either. So anyway, I don't want to get off track too much. I better get back to my quiz.
Yeah, well, I do want to get, I'm of two minds about that, because number one, you know, it's one thing to say, it's not within my physical nature to be able to fly, but I still think that I can choose to do it. I just can't accomplish it. Whereas
you can try.
Right, but but with God, yeah, I mean, I can take a nosedive off our Fifth Third building here, but I'm not going to. But I mean, I can will to be free from a chair, even if I can't physically get out of my restraints. Right, I can will all day long, I just can't do it.
Well, you can choose whether to go for a walk or go for a run.
Yeah.
At least, I mean, you can. Not everybody can.
Right.
But you've got the ability.
But you can choose to will it. You just can't choose to make yourself physically able to accomplish something that you physically can't. And so when I think about God's nature, see, one of the things that I have a problem with people when they take the God can only choose according to his nature, and they want to ground and good in his nature. And I agree with all that, but the problem is God's nature is not a stuff. God's nature is not God's God, right? Mm-hmm. So I mean, when people tell me it is impossible for God to lie, I tell them it's not a metaphysical impossibility. It's just stupid that he'd never do it. He doesn't need to do it, right?
Too smart for him.
Yeah. And so when the Bible says that it's impossible for God to lie, that's a rhetorical impossibility. It's not like saying it's logically impossible for God to string sentences, words together in a sentence that outputs a falsehood. He could do it. He's just never going to do it, right?
I once had Dallas Willard as a lecturing professor when I was doing my master's degree, and he said, well, of course God could sin, but why would he want to?
Right.
He's too smart for that.
That's right. He said sin is slop. That's what Dallas Willard would say. He says sin is slop. Great loss there. Okay, so let's keep going with the quiz.
Okay, so let me back up just to remind people. Question 1, is it true that God existed in a state of aseity logically prior to creating the universe and thus without the universe? Most people say yes. Question 2, in the state of aseity, is God omnipotent? Most people say yes, and then I add, if so, does he possess the power to create creatures with libertarian freedom? Most people say yes, even if they don't think he did. Question 3, in this state of aseity, is God omniscient? If so, does he possess the knowledge of what these libertarian free creatures that he has the power to create, even if he never does create them, would freely do? Does he have that knowledge? Now, I say, look, if one answers no to any of those questions, you might be a heretic. In fact, I think I said that in my book. And then I say, if one answers yes to all of the above, then congratulations, you're a Molinist, at least a mere Molinist. So this is because if one affirms that God is both omnipotent and omniscient in the state of affairs logically prior to the creation of the universe, then some flavor of Molinism's got to be true. God would possess the power to create libertarian free creatures, even if he never did create them, and God would know exactly how these free creatures would freely think, act, believe, and behave logically prior to his creative decree. So anyway, now
the Calvinists would push back and say, well, that last question does raise an issue we're going to get to here in a second, but the Calvinists and the open theists, which I don't know that they're heretics, but I don't consider either camp heretics. I think they're both equally wrong, but some Calvinists and open theists would say that it is logically impossible for God to know what a libertarian free creature would do in any given circumstance, whether that creature existed or not. They would say there's nothing to know there.
Yeah,
there's
so
no
that's
there.
Grounding objection. And so did you want to talk about that later?
Yeah, I wanted to get to that, but that's the response that I've heard when they say to that last question. They might say, the open theists and Calvinists would agree on this, where they would say...
Not all Calvinists. I would say...
Well, not all. Like Bruce Ware, who affirms Molinism, wouldn't. There are Calvinists / Molinists out
Yes,
there,
there are.
but some would say God can't know because God's, which is one of my problems in this very question I'm asking. So God can't know. God doesn't know unless he doesn't foreknow what he never foreordains, or he only knows what he foreordains. That's the Calvinist line, which I think that undermines the static aseity that you were talking about, which is kind of what my question is about. Why does God have to do something to know something? That's my thing. The Calvinists too. God can only foreknow what will happen if he ordains it. Ordaining is doing. It's not knowing is who God is. Ordaining is what he does. And so why does God have to do in order to be? For God to be, for God to be omniscient, why does he have to do in order to be? And that's my question with
all that changes is God knows everything that he could do.
Mm-hmm.
And based on that, and this is going to get us even into like the fine-tuning argument for God's existence. And I'll talk about that. We can talk about that later. But so God knows everything he could do. He knows all the different things he could create.
Mm-hmm.
So if he's all powerful, he's got a range of options, right? All powerful implies, I mean, omnipotent means, or omnipotence means omnipotent, right?
Yeah.
So you've got a whole bunch of things that God can do.
Mm-hmm.
And he can refrain from doing any of it. He can stay in a static state of aseity. It's a perfect state. It doesn't need to create anything. Or he can create a whole bunch of things. He's got the power to do it. So if God is omnipotent, he's got a range of alternative options from which to choose that are each compatible with his nature. That's the definition of libertarian freedom right there, the epitome of it. So yeah, if somebody's going to say that God is not free, that God could not have done otherwise, then they're saying that he is not omnipotent. They're going to say,
they're saying that this universe we live in is a necessary being just as much as God.
Well, that too. They're going to say that and I get into that in my book, that if that's the case, then we exist just as necessarily as God, albeit with beginnings.
Right. That's a problem.
Yeah, it is. It's a big theological problem. However, if God is omnipotent, the person that denies God's libertarian freedom says that God is unipotent, not omnipotent. Right. So there's a low view of God right there. God is not a maximally great being on that view. But the vast majority of Christians are going to say that God is omnipotent. Now, if God is omnipotent, that means he could do a whole bunch of things that he never does.
Right.
If God is omniscient in that static state of aseity, then God would know all that would happen if he did X, Y, or Z, right? So God would know everything he could do and all that would happen if he did it.
Right.
Now,
that's the middle knowledge.
That's middle knowledge right there.
Right.
Yeah.
But again, he doesn't know the will be's until after he does something. He only knows what the will be's are as would be's until he decrees, at least in Molinism Molinism. And then once he decrees, he knows that what will be out of all the would be's. But until and that's what I'm talking about, this logical dependence between what he knows and what he does. And
what will happen is based on what he has chosen. So think about it this way. All the decree does is change the words would freely to will freely.
Yes.
So consider the following. God knows that Sally would freely choose X instead of not X if he were to create her in non-causal deterministic circumstance C.
Yeah, okay? He knows it as a would, but then once he decrees, he knows it as a will. And I'm saying, why not always just know it as a will, since he's always going to know what he decrees?
Well, okay. So if God knows Sally would freely choose X instead of not X, if you were to create her in non-causal deterministic circumstance C, then God chooses to create Sally in non-causal deterministic circumstance C. Now, in a logical sense, God knows Sally will freely choose X instead of not X in non-causal deterministic C.
So there's a change in God's knowledge from, and
no. So let me just say this. Here's the takeaway. Just because the word would transforms to will, the word freely doesn't magically disappear. No,
that's not the problem. The very problem is the change of knowledge of what a would be into a will be is a change in God's knowledge.
Okay.
Problem for aseity.
there's no change in that static state. So that's just referring, and you mentioned it, the reference to God, to the logical ordering, not the chronological.
Right.
So there's nothing chronological happening in the static state.
No.
But there is a logical ordering, but it's not things that are happening one after another like that. So in that state,
right,
one can say that God simply knows everything he could do, all that would happen if, and then he has made a choice in that static state of what he will choose. And so then now he knows all that will freely occur in the universe as well.
Right,
now,
but only because now, but see, that's the thing. That's the very issue that it raises, is that now he has a knowledge of what will be based upon something that he did, instead of just based upon
something that based on his choice.
Right. That's a the logical dependence between an attribute of who God is and something that he does that he didn't have to do. So therefore, his knowledge is dependent upon an action instead of just being knowledge. That's the question.
Yeah, and I think you can say based on his choice, his knowledge is based on his choice of what to do.
Right. And that's what gets into a problem for Calvinists would say, yeah, exactly. That's what we're saying. And it goes to like what Stratton would have said about Molinism is just gratuitous because God knows what will be based upon what he decided would be. And so why do we need this middle knowledge, when God's natural knowledge of all that could be, and so it bumps in, and that's my problem with Calvinism too, because Calvinism has a logical dependence upon God's knowledge. His attribute is dependent upon his action too. That's the same problem. That's right. Why I think the logical ordering is a problem for both Molinism and our not mere Molin, but if you just think, yeah, God knows, who knows how he knows? I just know that he knows, But for those who say that his free knowledge of the will be's is based upon an action that he takes, that's a logical dependence there. That's the point. He has to do in order to be. God shouldn't have to do anything to be God.
He doesn't. He's still God just by simply having natural and middle knowledge. So
why would he not? Why does he need a decree to have the free knowledge?
Well, is it possible for God to remain in a static state of aseity?
I would think yes, because there has to be a temporal universe for there to be a sequence of. There has to be a universe for there to be anything besides God.
Yeah. So
static aseity is just God in and of himself, sans cosmos.
Yeah, sans creation.
Yeah.
And so if God never created, then God would never have free knowledge.
Well, so God's knowledge is logically increased by performing an action.
I guess you could say it that way. It would have to be. It logically follows if God chooses to create. So he's got to know everything he could do and what would happen if.
So even the open theist is going to come.
He's always got middle knowledge, even if he never creates. So in that static state of aseity, if God is omnipotent and omniscient, he must have middle knowledge.
I agree with that. Everyone that I know that understands middle knowledge eventually accepts it, and everyone who keeps rejecting it doesn't know what it is. They think they do, but they don't know what.
So your problem is, God's gaining knowledge.
Yeah, and so that's where the open theist is going to be like, so why do you need exhaustive divine foreknowledge? See, this question, what it does is, and the reason why I always ask it, is because it exposes a similar problem with Calvinists, but Calvinists are cool with it because they will freely acknowledge that God can't know anything about what will be unless he determines it, right? They have no problem saying God's stupid unless he does something. God has to do something to be God because God can't just be God. So it exposes that. And Calvinists, they bite that bullet. It sounds like you're going to bite the bullet and say, yeah, there is no, it's logically impossible to know a will be unless God decrees. So you're saying, yes, so you bite the bullet as a Molinist and say,
I don't see it as a bullet.
Okay, right. But it is for the open theist who says, yeah, we agree with the Calvinists. God can't know future free actions unless he determines it. And you're just smuggling in libertarian freedom for the one of it.
So I'm going to push against that, the open theists
Right.
assertion. I don't think that's true.
I don't either, but I want to know why you don't think it's true.
Because I know, or because, again, going back to Sally and non-causal deterministic circumstance C, if God knows if he creates her in that non-causally deterministic circumstance, that she will freely choose exactly how she would freely choose. And so then he creates Sally in that circumstance, in the freedom permitting circumstance, and now Sally will freely choose. So the only thing that's changed is God knows what would have happened if he creates. He creates, now he knows what will happen freely, how Sally will freely choose.
Right,
So,
the modal changes. It's
that's all. It's just, I don't see it as a big deal.
So you think a modal change is not a fundamental change in God's omniscient nature of all knowing?
No, I don't. I think
any different than a tense change, given the temporal. I mean, assuming you're an atheist, for example, which you kind of, I think any thinking person needs to be. Are you an atheist or a B theorist?
I'm an atheist, but I have a lot to say on that. And
me too, because God can't be talking to Moses and not talking to Moses at the same time in the same sense. But if B theory is true, he is, and there's a contradiction. But I
actually discussed time theory in the last chapter of my book.
Yes, but see, the open theist has to agree with your quiz that God can create libertarian, because that's their thing too. That right. God has to be able to do this. But their problem is, but how can God know? Because this is where they either bump into the modal fallacy themselves, or the clever open theists are going to say it's a logical impossibility to know what a free creature definitely will do. That's where they go with it.
So do you want to talk about the grounding objection?
No, but I wanted to throw that out there because I know our audience is going to want to hear about it. Let me give you, okay, go ahead and let's get into this, because this is, I mean, I'm just trying to cover the basis. I don't actually care about this objection personally. I just want to put that out there. I know that so many people do, because they think it's the aha, I got you, philosophers, Molinists, people who never read the Bible, even though most of your books about the Bible. The grounding objection seems to be this. They think it's this big dark cloud. Now, you know how I respond to the grounding objection before I let you say everything you want to say?
How's that?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how God knows stuff.
That's a good response, actually.
Right? Well, I don't know. I know that he does. Just like I know that God exists by the necessity of his nature. How does he do that? I have the slightest idea. But neither does anyone else that I've talked. How does never not existing work? Tell me that. Explain that to me. Okay, well, I don't. Yeah, I don't know what that's like. You don't either. But we both agree that he exists by the necessity of his nature, and that somehow it works. That he never not was. Sans cosmos, with cosmos, whatever, that God exists by the necessity of his nature. We both agree. How? We both don't have a clue what that's like. Same thing. How do you know all things? I have the slightest idea. And guess what? You don't know. You don't know.
How does God create the universe from nothing?
Yeah.
Beats the heck out of me, but I sure know that he did. Right.
So, that's my answer. I don't know. You don't know either. But saying that God can only know something because he foreordained it sounds silly to me. Because on Calvinism, that he only, because they just say they get rid of middle knowledge, so it's all dominoes all the way down. I know Chris Date, our fellow colleague, hates that, but Chris Date, dominoes and puppets and robots and action figures all day long till you refute it, buddy. All day long. It's not a straw man. It's not a straw man. It's prove me wrong. Prove it's not robots and puppets and strings. It's until I get a satisfaction, to my satisfaction, that you show me how it's not like that, I'm going to keep using puppets and robots and stuff. And the same thing with Calvinism, saying God only knows because he foreordained. That's where they get his free knowledge after, and all he has is natural knowledge on Calvinism, except for Bruce Ware and people like him. But they're like, God, he knows what he can do, and then he knows what he will do in the decree, and then he knows what will happen because he's making them happen, right? The robots and puppets and action figure. So you and I both have a problem with that, because God's authoring all kinds of evil and midget gay porn's God's idea, not evil creatures. It's just bad all the way around.
Yeah.
So I'm not monetized, so I can say gay midget porn, and and that so that I can't get flagged. But no, I mean, every sin is all God's idea ultimately. So that's bad. But they still agree with the open theists about this one thing, that, well, if God doesn't determine it, then he can't know it.
Yeah. So that's an assertion that I don't agree with.
Right. I think it's stupid, because I don't know how God exists by the necessity of his nature. I just know that he does, and so do you. So what are we talking about? I don't have to know the metaphysical mechanics of God's divine nature. But but what do you want to say about it? Because I flippantly dismiss it. Yeah, about the grounding objection. What's your response? Give us the highbrow response, not my nonsense.
Okay, so I would say there's several things that we could say. I mean, first, I just want to make it clear that although I have written on this topic, it's in my book, I touch on the grounding objection. I don't consider myself to be an expert on the topic, at least like some people, some of my colleagues that just laser focus on this issue. So that is to say that although I've studied the grounding objection enough to make some comments about it and to write about it, there are others who have basically dedicated their lives, so to speak, to this entire issue. And I think of one of my friends, John Lamonto, just loves this topic and knows more about it than anybody else I know. And in fact, I reference him on this issue in my book when I address the subject. But he's also written some articles on my website, freethinkingministries.com. But with all that said, I'd like to, I do want to study the subject more, but the first thing I'd say is that it's really sad when people who don't understand the objection at all appeal to this objection in order to keep their Calvinism or any other non-Molinistic view. And I think of guys like James White. I don't think he really grasps the grounding objection, but he sure appeals to it all the time. But with that said, he's not the only one. Many people do it. But it seems to me that within Christendom, only open theists have logical access to the grounding objection. I think it will blow up in the Calvinist face if they try to appeal to it. So let me explain. So many anti-Molinists offer this philosophical objection, and again, it's not based on scripture or biblical data. This is a purely philosophical objection. So many anti-Molinists appeal to the grounding objection, offer it against Molinism in an attempt to defeat it. Now, not only do I think the grounding objection seems philosophically weak, like you do, you gave I think a good objection or a good defeater to it. Now, Dr. Kirk McGregor, who I think is, I consider him to be the leading expert in all things Molinism, at least with regard to history of Molina's thought. And
he wrote the foreword to your book.
He did write the foreword, yep.
Yes.
But McGregor knows a lot about Molinism, and he recently said that he considers the grounding objection to be utterly worthless. That's a quote. Now, I won't make such.
Him and I agree.
Yeah. Now, I won't make such a strong claim. If people want to hear that, I actually interviewed him on my podcast, on the Free Thinking podcast, episode 100, if anybody wants to go reference that. But
that's at freethinking.com, right?
Freethinkingministries.com.
Freethinkingministries.com. And then you got it on YouTube?
Then we have the Free Thinking Ministries YouTube channel. So just go to YouTube, search for Free Thinking Ministries, and hit that subscribe button.
Yes.
And then we've got the podcast called the Free Thinking Podcast. And you can find on Facebook too. We have the Free Thinking Podcast Facebook group and the Free Thinking Ministries page. And I'm still trying to keep all that in order, trying to keep those. I'm like, is it the group or the page? I don't know. But anyway, I'll just say this. You know what the Bible says about people who say, well, how can God know? Psalm 73, 11 and 12. Let me read it to you. It says, here it is. And they say, How can God know? Is there knowledge in the Most High? Behold, these are the wicked. So, I mean, according to Scripture, those who deny God's omniscience and even pose the objection of how can God know are wicked. Now, okay, we can have a debate about how to interpret that correctly, but at face value, that should at least get our attention whenever we say, "Oh, God can't know something. How could He do that?"
Right.
So, but as I explain in my book, anyone who doubts or rejects the maximal greatness of God is on dangerous ground. So this is a major problem for anyone who claims to be a Bible-believing Christian and also appeals to the grounding objection against God's perfect knowledge. Now, for the sake of argument, I do contend that if a Christian theist thinks the grounding objection passes, or at least asserts that it does, then he or she is left with limited options from which to choose. So think about this. If an omnipotent God who has the power to create free creatures cannot know how free creatures would freely choose if he were to create them, then we seem to be left with only two options: either affirm exhaustive divine determinism or open theism. One of the two. You got two options from which to choose: exhaustive divine determinism, which many Calvinists affirm, or open theism. Now, I'll just say this: many Calvinists reject exhaustive. No, maybe not many, but I'd say a growing number seem to be rejecting exhaustive divine determinism, and I reference them in my book. But I think you've got, if you're going to say God cannot know how free creatures would freely choose if he were to create them, then you've got exhaustive divine determinism or open theism. Now, if God does not know how creatures would freely choose if he were to actualize them, then creatures are not free in a libertarian sense ever. I argue for that in my book. Or it means that we are free in a libertarian sense, but God simply does not know what we would freely choose if he were to actualize creatures with libertarian freedom. So all that to say, if God does not possess the knowledge of how free creatures would freely choose if he were to create them, then we either lose the libertarian freedom of humans and get exhaustive divine determinism, or we lose God's perfect knowledge and we get open theism. So the question is raised, between the two, exhaustive divine determinism and open theism, what is the inference to the best explanation? Oh, wait a second. You got to stop right there. Stop the presses. Because inferring the best explanation and engaging in the process of rationality is impossible on exhaustive divine determinism. Right. I argue for that in depth and detail in my book. Now,
that's the free thinking argument against. I mean, that works for atheists. It works for.
That's right.
Yeah. Brilliant argument. You're not making any rational affirmations. You're just the same thing that made the same mechanic or metaphysics that somebody concluded that they're a pink unicorn is the same thing that you came to your theological idea. It's just.
That's right.
Yeah. You can't rationally affirm why. It's just that's right. What you were determined to think, like someone was determined to think they're a pink unicorn.
That's right. So what logically follows from that? If the grounding objection passes and one believes they have rationally concluded that Calvinism or exhaustive divine determinism is the inference to the best explanation, then open theism must be true. So that's it blows up in their face. So right. Consider the following syllogism.
Or they have to accept that they're not being rational.
Yeah.
They could just say, well, I'm irrational.
But they're assuming that they've rationally reached the view that exhaustive divine determinism is true. So here's a syllogism. Premise one, it's five steps. Premise one, if the grounding objection passes, then God does not possess knowledge of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, CCFs for short, logically prior to his creative decree, and Molinism is false. 2, if God does not possess knowledge of CCFs logically prior to his creative decree, then either exhaustive divine determinism is true or open theism is true. 3, if exhaustive divine determinism is true, then one is not free to engage in the process of rationality to infer and affirm the best explanation, right? Rationally inferred and rationally affirmed knowledge is impossible.
Right.
4, therefore, if one affirms that one has rationally inferred that exhaustive divine determinism is the best explanation, or that it's probably true, and they believe that the grounding objection passes, then exhaustive divine determinism is false. 5, therefore, if one thinks the grounding objection passes and shows that Molinism is false, then open theism is the only live option left to rationally affirm. So,
and all my open theist friends are saying, yeah, amen.
Right. Now,
welcome to the club, Tim. That's what they want to.
Here's my point. Before I go on to argue against the open theists, I just want to say that all the Calvinists out there who are appealing to the grounding objection, in order to keep your Calvinism, that's going to blow up in your face, and now you're going to have to affirm open theism. So most Calvinists...
Or affirm that you're irrational. Or that you have no rational basis to believe what you believe.
Yeah, that's impossible, because now they've got to rationally affirm that they can't rationally affirm claims of knowledge. But then they would...
I agree.
That's self-defeating, so you can't do it.
Right.
And then why would anybody want to listen to them anymore if they say that they cannot rationally infer or affirm claims of knowledge? They're saying that they don't know anything. Right. So, but here's the deal. There's so many Calvinists out there that are offering the grounding objection. And I'm saying, look, Calvinists, they might not like Molinism, but one thing that they don't like more than Molinism is typically open theism.
Right.
But what you're doing here
is proving open theism.
Yeah, you're arguing for open theism if you're going to use the grounding objection. So don't do that, right? Calvinists, you and I both don't like open theism. So let's not appeal to the grounding objection. Now,
I think it's wrong. It doesn't bother me, and I don't care. But
yeah. So I'll just say this:
I don't lose sleep over it, but I think it's false.
Here's a simple equation: theism plus the grounding objection plus rationality equals open theism. Mm-hmm. So since I don't think open theism is true, I've got to either reject theism, the grounding objection, or rationality. Well, guess what? Of those three, I'm going to affirm theism and rationality. You've got to. So I've got to explain why I don't think the grounding objection works, and I do that in my book. Yes. And I can do it here if you'd want me to.
Well, I don't think it works because it doesn't mean anything. All you're saying is it's just incredulity. I don't know. I can't think of any way that God would ever. Okay, well that's okay. I can say the same thing about existing by the necessity of his own nature. So what? I don't care about your incredulity. That's all the grounding objection reminds me of. So I mean, I'm with you. But how would you respond now? What's your pushback to our open theist friends out there?
I guess I'd say that ultimately, if God is a maximally great being, then God must possess middle knowledge prior to his creative decree and prior to creation. So I'll give you a couple different arguments here. Here's one from my book. This was originally from a journal article that Quibbles, Erasmus, and I co-authored a couple years ago now. And it goes like this, just three steps. Premise 1, if God lacks middle knowledge, then God is not a maximally great being. 2, God is a maximally great being. 3, therefore God has middle knowledge. Now, the Molinist and the divine determinist both affirm premise 2, and thus the crucial premise here is premise 1. But why think premise 1 is true, that if God lacks middle knowledge, then he's not a maximally great being? Well, it seems clear, at least to me, that a being whose knowledge of counterfactuals does not depend on the being's prior will, decisions, or actions is greater than a being whose knowledge of counterfactuals does depend on these. So to illustrate this knowledge, the following thought experiment can be offered. So suppose that both Sally and Jones know that, we'll call this proposition B, right? If Smith were to run for president, Smith would win and become president. Now suppose further that Smith will eventually run for president and win, and thus proposition B is true. And that Sally and Jones know proposition B before Smith runs for president. Furthermore, suppose that Sally knows proposition B only because she has rigged the election, because everybody rigs elections these days. And she's rigged the election in such a way that Smith would win if he runs for president. In this case, Sally's knowledge of proposition B is not extraordinary or remarkable. So why should we be impressed by the fact that Sally knows proposition B, since we know that she intentionally performed actions that would guarantee proposition B. Sally's knowledge of proposition B depends on her prior knowledge of the rigged election. So big deal, right?
Right.
However, suppose that unlike Sally, Jones has not rigged the election, and he knows proposition B simply by virtue of his nature. So hence, Jones's knowledge of proposition B does not depend on his prior knowledge or actions. And in this case, Jones's knowledge of proposition B, it's remarkable. It's truly remarkable. Indeed, we should be impressed by the fact that Jones has the ability to know proposition B without having to do anything. So thus, it seems clear that Jones's knowledge of proposition B is greater than Sally's knowledge of B, precisely because Jones's knowledge does not depend on his prior decisions or actions, whereas Sally's knowledge does depend on her prior will, decisions and actions. So this thought experiment, I think, illustrates that a being whose knowledge of counterfactuals does not depend on the being's prior will, decisions, or actions is greater than a being whose knowledge of counterfactuals does depend on one or more of these. Now, since a maximally great being is omniscient, he will know all counterfactuals either prior to his will and have mental knowledge, or posterior to his will, but then he would lack mental knowledge. However, as we've seen, it's greater to know all counterfactuals prior to one's will, and thus a maximally great being must have middle knowledge. And since God is a maximally great being by definition, it follows that God has middle knowledge. Now, in order to avoid this conclusion, one might press this grounding objection, according to which middle knowledge is just logically impossible because there is nothing that grounds the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, or the CCFs that we were talking about. So here's the alleged problem. It's that CCFs are independent of God's will. If they are, then nothing makes them true, or there is nothing in virtue of which they are true. So consequently then, CCFs either lack truth values or they're all false. But either way, the grounding objection asserts that God cannot know such counterfactuals. They're saying, how could God know? Like we saw in Proverbs there. But unfortunately, since the advocates of the grounding objection often, I'll just say this, it's sometimes difficult to see what the problem is. So I've got 5 different propositions to consider here. So let's start with the first one. We'll just call this C1. All right, so C1 says a true contingent proposition is true in virtue of the existence of some concrete object or objects. So accordingly, for example, if the proposition Jones is eating eggs is true, then it is true in virtue of the existence of Jones and his action of eating eggs. However, C1 implies that contingent propositions about objects that no longer exist are false. So the proposition Socrates no longer exists today, for example, is false because there exists no concrete objects that render the proposition true. So then the objector will have to adjust C1 as follows. And now this gets us to C2. And it's expressed like this. A true contingent proposition is true in virtue of the existence or past existence of some concrete objects. Okay, but what about a future contingent proposition such as it will rain in Spain in exactly 10 years from today? Now, if I asserted this proposition 10 years ago, and it does in fact rain in Spain today, then surely it's correct to say that I asserted a true proposition 10 years ago. Thus, to account for future contingent propositions, the objector now should adjust C2 as follows. So here's C3. A true contingent proposition is true in virtue of the existence, past existence, or future existence of some concrete objects. Now C3, however, does not account for certain negative existential propositions such as the proposition unicorns have not, do not, and will not exist. Such a proposition is surely true even though the past, present, or future existence of one or more concrete objects does not render it or make it true. So hence, C3 will now have to be adjusted again So now we've got C4.
It's the same thing, almost the same thing as logical contradictions, just fantasy creatures that, I mean, it's either true or false that it'll never exist in the future. That's a true proposition about the future, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Right. So you can have knowledge of a future, outcome on a negative.
I think that's a good way to say it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm tracking with you.
All right. So here's C4, and that's expressed like this: a true contingent proposition is true in virtue of the existence, past existence, future existence, or non-existence of some concrete objects.
Right.
But now we can see that it's really facts or obtaining states of affairs and not the existence of some concrete objects that ground true contingent propositions. So
the state in the realm of ideas.
Yeah, I think so. So consider it like this: Socrates is dead is grounded by the fact that Socrates is dead. Yeah. It will rain in Spain tomorrow is grounded by the fact that it will rain in Spain tomorrow. And unicorns do not exist is grounded by the fact that unicorns do not exist.
Right.
So consequently, if the objector then insists that CCFs must be grounded or have truth makers, then the Molinist can simply respond that CCFs are grounded by counterfactual facts. For example, the CCF, if Jones grew up in Germany, then he would learn to speak French, is grounded by the fact that if Jones grew up in Germany, then he would learn to speak French. And so now the Molinist can simply adjust C4 and get C5. And that's expressed like this: a true contingent proposition is true in virtue of the fact that some concrete objects exist or did exist or will exist or don't exist or would exist under specific conditions. Now, C5 seems to be as reasonable as C4, at least it seems that way to me, and thus the grounding objection, or if the grounding objection is to succeed, then one's got to show exactly why C5 is implausible while C4 is plausible.
And we'll see 1 through 4 is plausible.
Yeah, right. Now, I could be missing something here, but Erasmus and I offered this, I think 2.5 years ago now, in Perichoresis 16.2 as a journal article, and I don't think this challenge has been met, at least so far. So I'm looking forward to maybe some people interacting with it here, but. It seems to me that that the grounding objection is, because of this, unsuccessful, and the middle knowledge is in fact possible, and therefore we have good reasons to believe that God, as a maximally great being, has middle knowledge. He knows everything he could do and everything that would happen if he did it. Now let me give one more argument here based upon the fine-tuning argument. So any Christian apologist out there who thinks the fine-tuning argument is good and they advance it, guess what? You're affirming middle knowledge. And also, it's not just an argument for God's existence, it's an argument against the grounding objection, or so it seems to me. And here's what's funny.
Hey, you need to explain this one. There's people that are going, huh?
Okay.
They've been using this argument for years now, and they're like, I'm also proving Molinism. All right. Let's hear you, yeah. Doctor, the newly crowned Dr. Stratton.
Yeah, since I'm newly crowned, I could be making a big mistake here, but I think this is right. And in fact, I think it was back in 2016 when I first kind of started connecting these dots, and I ran it by Dr. Craig, and he agreed with me. This was at the EPS conference in San Antonio at the time, and I ran it by him. In fact, somebody took a picture of him, and he went like, "Whoa!" like that, and we got the picture. It's on Facebook somewhere. But
you impressed William Lane Craig.
That's well, no comment. There was also a philosopher, theologian there, who was an anti-Molinist, but he was advancing the fine-tuning argument. And we went out to lunch, and I explained to him, I'm like, look, if you think the fine-tuning objection is a good argument for God's existence, you're also appealing to his middle knowledge, and thus the grounding objection doesn't pass either. And he wanted me to explain it to him. And today he's a Molinist. So,
oh, wow.
yeah. So let me unpack this. So the fine-tuning argument, Dr. Craig advances this. He's probably the one of the most well-known Christian philosophers today that advances this argument. But it usually goes like this. Premise one, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Premise two, the fine-tuning is not due to physical necessity or chance. Three, therefore, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to intelligent design. So it's intelligence here. Now, this intelligence based on knowledge, all right? So this has great significance, relevance to Molinism, as I've been saying here, which explains God. The God has certain knowledge of what would occur in possible worlds if he were to fine-tune the initial conditions of the early universe with all these special numbers, right? These all these constants and quantities, right? If you study the fine-tuning argument, you see all these crazy huge numbers that if they were off by, as Dr. Craig says, even a hair's breadth, a life-permitting universe would not exist. So check this out. This also entails that God would possess perfect counterfactual knowledge not grounded in anything that actually exists, right? This is knowledge that's not grounded in anything that actually exists or has existed or even that will exist. God has this knowledge about all these big numbers, what would happen if he did it.
If the dials were fidgeted in any infinite number or potentially infinite number of different ways, God either knows what will happen in that cosmos or doesn't, just like he knows what will be in this cosmos, or he doesn't.
That's right. And so if this intelligent design and not accident or luck, right? If God actually dialed in all the dials and knobs just right in order to get a life-permitting universe, God had to know what these initial conditions, all these constants and quantities, he had to know how all of these would be in order to guarantee what would happen. And if it's not the case, then it's not intelligent design.
Because you gotta say he knows the right ones, but if he didn't know which all the wrong ones and what would happen, then how would he ever have known the right one?
That's exactly right. If it's intelligent
design, clever, Tim. Very clever.
Right. Thank you.
I like it.
So if God possessed knowledge of what would follow from a certain fine-tuned point of singularity logically prior to his creative decree to actualize the universe, and God could have adjusted these initial conditions otherwise to bring a different kind of universe or none at all into existence, then God possesses knowledge of what he could accomplish. And moreover, given this knowledge, God also knows what would happen if the initial conditions of the Big Bang were not so finely tuned or tuned otherwise. So therefore, if God possesses the power to create worlds other than the world that actually exists or none at all, and if God knows all that would happen in all these other worlds if the initial conditions of these other worlds or universes would have been different and actualized instead, then this seems to strongly suggest that God possesses the middle knowledge advocated by Luis de Molina. Now, McGregor...
Or he has a dial, doesn't know what the heck would happen, and that seems stupid to say.
Well, that's not intelligent design.
Right. So if you believe that God created the heavens and the earth, you're a Molinist or just confused.
Amen to that.
So the first sentence of the Bible, if you believe that this universe, by all accounts, is finely tuned for life, God either knew that and then knew where not to turn the cosmological constants a hair's breadth, because who knows what would happen? Either God knows what would happen or God's not omniscient. So and there's nothing to ground those universes because they're possible worlds, but they're not actual worlds, so they don't exist. He either knows what would have happened, because given a world, you're given a sequence of contingent events that follow. You either know what would happen or you don't.
Ding, ding, ding! You got it.
He can know and if he can know contingents, then he can know free ones.
Yeah, I think If he can know,
if he can know future contingents, he can know, and he can create libertarian free creatures like the Calvinists will begrudgingly admit and open theists admit, that if he can know counterfactuals of the future, then he can know libertarianly free counterfactuals of the future.
Yeah. Now, this even gets us, but let's just say, okay. So McGregor, in his book on Molina, he says middle knowledge is God's knowledge of all things that would happen in every possible set of circumstances.
Right.
Both things that are determined to occur by
Yes.
those circumstances and things that are not determined to occur by those circumstances. So let's just say that God creates a universe. He fine-tunes the initial conditions of the Big Bang to guarantee a life-permitting universe. But let's just assume that determinism is true. He still would have the knowledge of what world would come into existence billions of years later, fine-tuned for life, based, and that knowledge, that fine-tuning knowledge, is still not based upon anything that actually exists. Now, as soon as one grants libertarian freedom, or even indeterminacy, like quantum mechanics,
right?
If God doesn't causally determine the movements of quantum mechanics, is God still sovereign over that? I mean, so, but as soon as you get indeterminacy in the universe too, now it's even increased, this counterfactual knowledge. So anyway, to clarify, since God has natural knowledge, he knows what initial conditions of the Big Bang could produce. Since God has middle knowledge, he knows what specific initial conditions of the Big Bang would produce. And this knowledge is all possessed prior to creation, and thus it's not dependent on actual existing truth makers. So the grounding objection, it seems to me, is refuted by the fine-tuning argument. So this knowledge is simply grounded in a maximally great being who knows all he possesses the power to create and all that would happen if he created or created otherwise.
Yes, and here's the problem with being a self-loathing Molinist instead of, like what Braxton called, and also a problem with being petty is I'm just petty enough to say, I can't believe I never thought of that. But I'm glad that you brought this to my attention because I'm on board with it. That seems right.
Well, yeah. Thank you. I mean,
it demonstrates Molinism, and that the grounding objection, which I've always intuited was dumb. But I like it. I'm on board with that.
Yeah. But I like how you said it. I don't think.
But you have to share credit, so I don't have to be just jealous of you. You have to share credit with, what was it, Erasmus?
That was, I mean, I did share a lot with that first argument against the grounding objection. But the argument from the fine-tuning argument.
That's all you.
That was all me. No,
yeah, see, all right, now I'm going to be petty, and I have to be jealous of you. I think that's great, man. I actually, it never occurred to me to think about it that way, but that seems to make sense. I read an article, and I cannot remember the name of the guy who wrote it or the name of the article, but his thing with the grounding objection was like, yeah, I don't think this is a thing, because he said, consider the following statement. This is why he said, this sentence doesn't have a truth maker. And you're like, oh, yeah, it doesn't.
Yeah.
but it can be true without a truth maker.
Mm-hmm.
The sentence is, this sentence has no truth maker.
You're blowing my mind, man.
It doesn't, but it can be a true sentence.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
There's nothing that makes it true except for its absence of a truth maker. So, but the absence there kind of proves the point. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But yeah, man, I like this fine-tuning argument for Molinism, because God either knows what would have gone wrong or he doesn't. And if you say that he doesn't, then how does he know that this, of all the knowledge of what goes wrong, how do you know that he'd get this right?
Right.
Why does omniscience give you a right answer, but God can't know what would be the case had the nuclear weak force been a little bit different? God can't know that, Cosmos?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That seems weird to me, since because in his natural knowledge, he has to know what those dials do, but he has to have middle knowledge to know what will inevitably result from that. Or he just doesn't know, or he has no clue.
Yeah, then we get luck, not intelligent design.
Right.
And so say goodbye to the fine-tuning argument.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, now the one could say, okay, fine, I give up the fine-tuning argument. Okay. That seems like a high price to pay for a Christian to keep your theism. or to keep your grounding objection.
Right.
It's just, Molinism, as I say in the last sentence of my book, let me find it here and read it to you, if I can find the last page. There's so many, the bibliography section is huge, so, okay. Yeah, the last sentence of my book simply says, this is all to say, the inference to the best explanation of all the data is Molinism. And, what I love about it is I think it makes the best sense of biblical data. I think philosophically, it makes great sense. It allows perfect being theology, for God to be a maximally great being. In my book, I go and show how all these other views either have to deny either God's omnipotence, omniscience, or omnibenevolence. Some people, some theologians reject all of them. But as A.W. Tozer says, the church has allowed this weak view of God to infiltrate and to infect the Christians. And so he says, and I talk about this in my book, a low view of God. Did I say a weak view of God? A low view of God.
Yeah.
Leads to a multitude of other sins.
Now,
And
I know people gripe about perfect being or maximally great being theology within theism and say, well, that's a Greek philosophical, which has no purchase with me. That's like, yeah, it's a good thing. Greeks are smart. That's why the Bible's written in Greek, but so that we could have a New Testament. Yay, Greeks. But to me, without that, what you have is an incorporeal Thor. Mm-hmm. If you have less than that, you just have a souped up Thor or Zeus, just incorporeal. Well, that's not helpful or worthy of worship any more than a souped up Zeus or Thor is.
Yeah, and now I think we can, in my book, I spent some time.
Finite godism is a technical term for it, but anything less than perfect being theology or maximally great being theology is finite godism.
Right, it's a low view of God. Yep. I don't think we need the ontological argument to think God as a maximally great being. I think we can derive that from Scripture, but if one says we can't, we still got. I still think the ontological argument passes.
Yeah.
Even if it doesn't, I'm still going to say the concept of why not think of God as a maximally great being. Look, I know a lot of. I mean, I have a very high view of Scripture, but I have an even higher view of God. I believe that God is a maximally great being, and I think we can support that biblically, and we can support that philosophically, and just theologically too, I suppose. I guess that's perfect being theology right there. So I do argue for perfect being theology, and I think Molinism, at the end of the day, makes the most sense of Scripture, makes the most sense of, it allows perfect being theology to pass, where other views don't. And I just, like I said, I think it's the inference to the best explanation after considering all the data.
Yeah, I would say, I like the term mere Molinism because still Molinism, qua Molinism, and I think William Lane Craig embraces that. Still a little bit troublesome for me, but I think this mere Molinism idea, like if you talk to most Christians and you ask them kind of what Braxton Hunter asks them, you think God knows everything? You think God would know what you were doing if we weren't having this conversation right now? Okay, you're a Molinist. If you say
right.
You know, if you think God would know what you're doing if you hadn't had this conversation with me, but went to Starbucks to get coffee instead, and they're going to say, yeah, God knows what would have. Okay, you're a Molinist. And I think most Christians, which is why omniscience, I think, has been affirmed by the church for 2,000 years, like the concept of, and you know, whether it's fleshed out in kind of the simple foreknowledge view, which not so simple, and it seems to borrow capital from Molinism to get out of jams, or Molinism. It just seems like this is what we intuitively believe about God, right? Mm-hmm. And I have some Old Testament scholars, especially the open theism camp, will push back and say, yeah, but some of these lofty statements about God, they don't get you this perfect being. And I always push back and say, yeah, but if you take that all the way into the New Testament, what you see is maybe not philosophically tutored, but what you see is them trying to make the loftiest statements about God as humanly possible, you know, that are conceptually possible at the time. So, you know, when they say God knows all things, I know in the previous chapter it says man knows all things, but clearly John knows the difference between the category being that man is and the category being that God is. You know,
Right.
so I mean, they're trying to make these great making statements about God that I think if I asked a biblical author, does, you know, in my language, is God maximally great and does he know future free contingency? Yeah, he knows all that. They're not going to quibble over this stuff, right? Anything, you know. So I don't know. I don't see a problem with it. I don't see the logical objections to the possibility of libertarian free will having any merit because I can't see any contradictory thing about it.
Right.
That's what's required to be logically impossible. And there's nothing contradictory about assuming you have free will and me knowing what you're going to do tomorrow, right?
Mm-hmm.
My knowing, the modal fallacy doesn't make my knowing turn into you being my puppet, right? If I'm an omniscient being, I'll know what you do tomorrow, even if I don't determine it. So,
yeah, you know what how free creatures will freely choose.
I just don't find but I like this fine tuning thing. Really is helpful. I think that's the gold from this episode. And I really appreciate you coming on to talk about that. Is there anything else you want to say before we?
I guess I already promoted the book, so I'll do it one more time.
Yeah.
Freedom, Divine Knowledge, and Mere Molinism. And you can get that on Amazon. You can get a hardcover version for $40. The paperback version, I think, is $27. Or you can get it on Kindle for $9.99. That's the best deal. So do that. And also, please, again, check out my YouTube channel and subscribe, Free Thinking Ministries, and check out freethinkingministries.com. And man, people should just also enroll at Trinity Theological Seminary.
Amen. Yeah. So that we can get paychecks, right?
That's right. That's right.
No, so that they can learn from awesome professors like you and Braxton Hunter and Chris Date and everyone else. Leighton Flowers is okay. But no, I'm just kidding. I love Leighton Flowers. Leighton Flowers is one of the best professors that we have. He always does his stuff on time, unlike the president. But no, I'm just kidding. Braxton's on time a lot, but not.
I still got a lot of work I need to get to. So.
No, I know, and trust me, I'm happy to unload as much as humanly possible on you, where you're burning my name in effigy. But Tim, thanks for taking some time to come on to Trinity Radio, man. I appreciate it. I thank you so much. This was awesome. I loved 99% of what you've said. I'll go back. Yeah. Well, hey, that's bad. I sit next to Braxton Hunter, and I'm only pleased 60% of the time. So this is a step up. Anyway, thanks for coming on, and we'll see y'all next time on Trinity Radio.